All right, welcome to my brief seminar on organizational knowledge retention. My name is Carl Lemkool, and I'd like to share with you a little bit about how to keep knowledge in your organization. Just for a little bit of context, I'm a senior at Parks College of Engineering at St. Louis University in mechanical engineering. I'm an Eagle Scout. I've had 2 internships, but a majority of my leadership experience in recent history has come from Parks Racing FSAE team and Arcangel Ultimate Frisbee team. The scope of this project is to facilitate knowledge retention within Parks Racing. It's kind of a 3-pronged approach. There are knowledge share videos, which you can see in the bottom left, that detail some of the things that I've learned from the team and my experience with it on how to design a frame and how to analyze it, how to present those results, as well as some of my takeaways from my design projects. This presentation, which is intended to be more broad, it's so I think anyone could probably have some takeaway from this presentation, and then a personal reflection paper that will be submitted to my mentor. As you can see, Parks Racing is in the top left of this slide at Michigan competition back in 2017. Okay, so when you think about organizational knowledge retention, it's very common to think that it's at the bottom of your priority list. Purpose, funding, space, members, and growth are all more important. That's actually wrong. That's a pretty big misconception. It's actually one of the most critical things you can think about. Repeating mistakes is incredibly costly and discouraging. Not transferring knowledge is essentially the same as losing it, so that makes it very difficult to improve year to year. In addition to that, it's a very common problem. It's not uncommon for people to not have a plan with how to address it. And successful knowledge transfer can in fact elevate an organization because it's such a common problem. Okay, so before I talk about the different types here, they are based on subjective observations, and they're divided based on the solution type. So the examples are going to have some overlap. The first one I'd like to talk about is osmosis. It's the process of gradual or unconscious assimilation of ideas, knowledge, and more. So essentially what that's talking about is the type of learning or knowledge transfer that happens through a master-apprentice relationship or just group projects with people of different experience levels. If you work with somebody who's done this thing before, you're going to learn something from them, inevitably. The advantage of this is that it transfers lessons learned as well as processes. You might figure out why they choose to do something rather than just what they choose to do. And it happens naturally and therefore is very effective. People tend to remember from experiences very well. The risk is that it's informal and haphazard and can miss important information. So as such, it's a very high-risk strategy to rely only on experiential knowledge transfer. Then the second one I wanted to touch on is the elders. The knowledge and lessons learned with people who have been in the organization for a long time naturally build up, right? These people have been around the block, they've seen what's happened, and in addition, if they're passionate enough to be a leader in the organization or stay there for a long time, odds are they probably bring some outside experience. Typical examples of this can be an advisor, a consultant, a coach, or even just a veteran member that's been there for a while. Advantages, like I mentioned, they typically bring past experience, and they also tend to provide longevity and stability. That in the sense that they will be there for a long time. So, if you have a high turnover rate, especially in the context of a college club, those people can kind of keep the club grounded, give a sense of continuity and also bring some continuity to the knowledge in the team. Risks are that they can rob others of the ability to lead. And this is a little bit more of a complex risk, so bear with me here. I'll use the example of a Little League coach. Little League being a relatively high turnover organization, so it often can be tempting to have the coach do everything, right? But the risk is if the coach is hitting all the balls at batting practice and making 100% of the calls on the field and, yelling at the kids and completely taking all the leadership, then that might be on paper the most efficient way to lead the organization. But at the end of the day, you're gonna hurt yourself in terms of long-term growth because you're not letting some younger players step up to the plate, if you will, in terms of leadership. So that's something to keep in mind. And a good way to avoid that is clearly think through how these elders' roles are defined. The last one I wanted to talk about is formal transfer. Um, this can include anything from training, requirements, written, videos, etc. But I'll divide them into two categories, and they're pretty straightforward here. Like written formal transfer, which would include instructions, reflections, engineering specifications, anything like that. The advantages are it's great for transferring objective knowledge, or not even just objective knowledge, but very clearly point by point, 1, 2, 3, clearly truncated points of knowledge. It's very efficient in that sense. It's the most efficient way to do that. But it can miss some lessons learned, especially if the person is being very, very deliberate at being only objective and not subjective about what they're writing down. The person who's reading it on the other end might understand, what they did, but maybe not why, and that could be a risk. The next one I'd like to talk about is dynamic formal transfer, which can include videos and classes. The advantage is that it's much more engaging than a written document, and it can include lessons learned. So, the person who's watching it, it probably can see in some cases why a decision was made, even if that's not explicitly stated. And it's obviously much more engaging to watch a 10-minute video than it is to read a really long document. The disadvantage is that they can be time-consuming to make, so they don't get made as often. So now that we've talked about the three different types, it's very important to sit down with your organization and think about how you're going to transfer knowledge. If you don't have a plan already, even just having considered it and thought through it, you're already a step ahead of having no plan. So don't be too afraid if your plan's not perfect the first time around. So things to consider. Existing methods. Even if you don't have a plan already in place, there are probably ways in which your organization transfers knowledge. So sitting down and thinking about what you guys do on a day-to-day basis will probably yield some results that will give you a good place to start. Think about how to supplement them, how to foster them more formally. The other thing is your organizational culture. When you're thinking about what methods to add or what methods to bolster, you want to try not to rub people the wrong way. It's going to be a lot easier to make a plan that's designed for your organization rather than to change your organization to fit a plan for knowledge transfer. And how you choose to implement all your different methods is going to tie into that. Like I said, it's not going to be expected that anything you do the first time is going to be perfect, but it will be better than doing nothing at all. So as long as you're revisiting your plan after every year and reviewing your results and revising your plan as such, I think you're in great shape. Okay, so I wanted to first take a case study of parks racing, since that they are the primary focus of my capstone project, and I'm pretty familiar with it. Before I do that, I wanted to mention Roses, Buds, and Thorns real quick. Roses is an organizational strength or something that's exemplary. A bud is an opportunity or something that's improving, and a thorn is something that's not that great, that could use improvement pretty bad. So parks racing has a strong history of experiential knowledge transfer. So that's what I want to talk about Osmosis first. It's a rose. It's something that's really good. But even though it's really good, that doesn't mean that you don't want to think of ways to improve it. So there are still ways that we can improve it, like formalizing through a master or apprentice or skill certification, and foster non-committal pairings and work days. But that's not to say that it desperately needs to be improved or anything. This is a really strong point that parks racing has going for it. The elders are something that is a bud. The strong team commitment culture cultivates people that are really knowledgeable and have a large body of the team's knowledge. The risk is that when these people leave, they might not necessarily, have a way to get that knowledge back to younger people. So to alleviate that risk of losing the knowledge that way, I recommend that we really encourage seniors to stay at least and give input to the e-board meetings, even if they're not around because of senior design or job interviews or other obligations. So essentially all I'm recommending is that they continue to pass down knowledge through some formalization of that role. The last thing I wanted to talk about is formal transfer. I think it's pretty widely recognized by different leaders of the club and different leaders within the university that this is a weakness of the team. There's not a lot of, formally recorded knowledge transfer. One thing I wanted to talk about to improve that was starting with simple written instructions that are easy to make for fabrication. So, if somebody leaves and doesn't know how to do something, they can check back on that knowledge base. And then starting to make some videos and more in-depth engineering practices. The ones that I've made, I'd like to be an example of this, but that's not to say that they couldn't be improved upon. The other thing I'd like to recommend is a license system or safety checklist for driving the car to alleviate any safety issues in the future. Okay, so the next one I wanted to touch on a little quicker potentially is Arcangel Ultimate, is another organization that I'm a part of. But what I want to demonstrate here is that the way you make your plan is going to be very different depending on the type of organization you're thinking about. So, a sports team is going to be very different than Parks Racing, but not just because of the difference of their mission, but also because of the difference in their organizational culture. Arcangel is a team that has a very strong culture of balancing enjoyment versus competitivity. So that's something that I was trying to keep in mind here when I was making these recommendations. So one I think that would fit into this kind of coexistence of enjoyment and competitivity would be improving the implementation of the buddy system that currently exists but probably could be used better. The elders are something that I think the team is doing well at this moment in the sense that we have a coach that is a person who brings prior experience and likely will be with the team for multiple years, and this gives the team the ability to have stability, where you're losing seniors, you're changing captains every year, you have likely some goals that are changing every year and some things that are changing every year, but by having a coach that's there every single year can, even if they're not giving a vote in what the team should do that particular year, they're still able to give their input and say, hey, I saw the team try to do this a couple of years ago. It didn't work all that well. And even if though they might not get a vote in exactly what the team's doing, it's can be really valuable tool for the e-board trying to make year-to-year decisions to have somebody who can see the big multi-year picture. As for formal transfer, that's something that could be definitely improved upon. The team does do post-tournament meetings and end-of-year meetings, but I think integrating formal record keeping of lessons learned, what competition was like at different tournaments, what different changes were made, and how they affected the actual on-field performance would be good. So again, just trying to think about your specific application and the culture of your specific organization when you're making your plan is very important. Okay, in conclusion, knowledge transfer is really critical. It's important that your plan addresses all three types, and it's important that you change your strategy to fit your organization, not the other way around. It's also very important that you revisit your plan periodically to address its shortcomings or review what was strong about it. Okay, before I move on, I'd like to thank a couple people who really contributed to this presentation. David Lemkool, my father, has some industry experience doing this type of thing, so I really appreciated his input. Dr. Mark McQuilling and Robert Pample were my advisors on this project and were both very helpful in putting it together. Parks Racing provided me a majority of the experience and all of the mentors that were involved, especially Dr. Chi-Hao Lei, in helping me, put boots to the ground in terms of some of these plans. I'd also like to thank John Maloney, Lauren and Sean Sullivan of Team Penske in Mooresville, North Carolina, who really helped me think through some of these plans and, how they would manifest themselves. So I really appreciate you checking out this presentation. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I forgot to click record on the live version, so I actually have recorded a couple of the questions that were asked. I did remember to click record for the last two questions, but I will re-answer the first three questions I got on the live one. The first one is, how does SGA facilitate knowledge transfer? So SGA is the Student Government Association at St. Louis University. They make policies. They help with leadership transitions. They allocate funding to organizations. Are a couple of their main roles, but they do all sorts of different stuff. And one of them, my answer to this question, is that they actually have a transition meeting every year where they have last year's president and next year's president come to this meeting together and kind of explain some of the high-level ways at which SGA interacts with them. And then they also have little breakout sessions where they ask the previous president to explain to the incoming president, how did the team do X? What did you do when Y? And I think that was really helpful. They also definitely try to encourage teams to do leadership transition packets where, you write down a whole packet of everything you learned or what you did, how you did it, and encourage you to pass that on to your successor in your role in your organization. I think that they're helpful in this sense, but they probably could do a little more in terms of actually checking that they're doing these. And kind of one of my points in this presentation is it is important enough of a thing that they should probably be concerning themselves with it. The next question I got is, who is responsible for developing these plans? And my answer was that a lot of organizations have an officer that's specifically in charge of training, but it's important enough of an issue that everyone should be bought into it. So even if there is somebody responsible for it on a day-to-day plan, how you make the plan and what changes you make to the plan and ensuring that the plan is working is something important enough that everyone should be on deck for it. If you have your annual e-board council end of year meeting, that should be one of the line items at the meeting is, how are we transferring knowledge? Is our current plan working? If there's no plan at all, I think anyone could draw up a plan and present it to everyone. I think it's important enough that everyone should be worrying about it. The next question I got, and the final one I'll be answering here before I throw it over to Live Carl, is why don't people do this if it's all good? Which I think is a fantastic question. This question was asked by Jacob Bullard, the president at the time of recording of Parks Racing, this is a really good self-aware question because it's not always easy to acknowledge that you're not good at something, but it takes another level of self-awareness to think about, okay, why are we not doing this? And it took me a second to think about that. But the answer that I went with is that it comes down to a comfort zone. In your personal life, your first reaction is to stay within your comfort zone, and I think the same thing applies to organizations. It takes work to step outside your comfort zone. It takes effort. It's going to be uncomfortable. Things aren't always going to go well the first time, but that's part of what I'm trying to acknowledge in this presentation is that it's okay if it doesn't go well the first time. Even if it doesn't go as well as planned, it will still be better than if you did nothing. So I think for Parks Racing in particular, it's just the way things have been done for a long time is that knowledge is transferred experientially and people stick around and teach other people things. And when they leave, they take their knowledge with them, and that's that. So it's worked for a long time, but it's not an easy thing to change. So that's the last thing I have here on the recorded one. I'm going to throw it over to Live Carl.
I have another question here that says, at what point do you try to transfer the knowledge? Like, wouldn't you do that? Like, you wouldn't do that week one with new members. So at what point would you? Yeah, I think that's a great question. You don't want to barrage, a new hire with 12 hours of training, despite how common that is to do. I think that's a bad approach. While it is important to get that knowledge transferred, it's more important that those people are bought in and spending their time with the organization. So over time, as I think as needed, essentially is the answer to that question. An as needed approach, as they need to be able to operate X machine, you say, okay, now we've got a training for that. Please read this set of instructions and watch this video of somebody 5 years ago operating that machine who was really good at it. Does that answer that question? Excellent.
I have a question.
Go for it.
In terms of a like college setting or like a college club setting, the osmosis versus elders is like an important distinction, or at least like that distinction makes sense. But that those two things almost seem very similar. Like what is the difference do you see in, let's say, like a civil engineering or mechanical engineering firm or something, between just working in the company as an individual under some people versus working in a company under somebody who's like directed as the person that you should be learning from?
Yeah, that's a good question, and thank you. I was proud of that distinction, but yeah, it can be a little not particularly clear. And again, kind of what I said earlier is that the examples, like you're observing, are going to be pretty similar. You know, it's you learn from somebody with more experience, oftentimes. But the distinction that I was going for there was in how you address it. So for an osmosis, I'm thinking about like how do you record experiential learning, or how do you make sure that people are learning experientially and that not certain people are benefiting more than others. Whereas with the elders, I'm thinking of how do you specifically prevent people with large bodies of knowledge from leaving the organization. And I think that's what it comes down to. Like osmosis, you want your whatever your solution that you come up with to be based around ensuring that newer people are learning experientially, or less people are learning from the more experienced people. And with the more experienced people, and with the elder solution, you want to think about kind of almost the same issue from the other side, but how do you ensure that those people with more experience aren't just doing their own thing, that they're also taking other people along for the ride and sharing their lessons learned and their knowledge that they've gained over the years. So it's kind of, it is a little bit of two sides of the same coin, but I do think that you need to make your approach intentionally address both.
Mm-hmm.
Some really good questions. Thank you for all those. Any final questions before I sign off here? All right. Well, I think that's all I have here. So, barring any further questions, I really appreciate all of your time. I hope you got something out of it, and you all have my contact info from the original calendar invite. So please feel free to contact me if you have any other questions. I did forget to record part of the presentation, but I'll go back and do a voiceover of all the slides and re-answer all the questions and everything. So there should be, in some form, a video of the presentation to reference later if you want to pass it along. So thank you all very much.
Good job, Carl.
I'm proud of you, Dad.